The following is the history of the cursed brass bell of Trussville, as I have come to understand it. I am remiss to admit that I have not been able to determine its origin, nor do I know how it came to reside in the rural farmhouse inherited by Daniel Hopkins in 1867. While typically I would continue my investigation of the item before parting with it, I have begun to hear ringing at night, and fear that I will soon suffer further symptoms if I do not part with the cursed thing. That said, its history is as follows. The bell's first victim, Daniel Hopkins, 1842 to 1869. Cause of death, suicide. In June of 1867, Daniel Hopkins inherited a rural farmhouse in Trussville, Alabama from his grandparents. Reports indicate nothing abnormal regarding his grandparents' passing, but I have not been able to ascertain the specific cause of their deaths. At the time, Daniel was the owner of a small carpentry business and a prominent member of the community. He had been happily married for 6 years and had 2 beautiful children, a boy and a girl. Although he owned a lovely home in town after inheriting the farmhouse, he began spending nights away from his family. These nights away became more and more frequent. By November of 1868, Daniel was spending weeks at a time alone at the farmhouse. He had grown distant from his family and stopped operating his business altogether. His wife Sarah wrote that his face had grown gaunt and sallow, that he had lost weight, and that he constantly complained of headaches, for which he blamed an incessantly ringing bell, which nobody else ever heard. In December of 1868, Daniel was found dead in the farmhouse. He had hung himself in the guest room, the same room which just so happened to house the brass bell. The bell's second victim, Timothy Hopkins, 1863 to 1870. Cause of death, apparent suicide. Timothy Hopkins was 6 years old at the time of his father's suicide. In her diary, Sarah Hopkins noted that her son had taken the brass bell for himself and that he kept it on his nightstand. She does not appear to think anything abnormal of the bell. She writes that Timothy began to spend most of his time alone in his room. He became moody and easily agitated, and he also began to complain of headaches. Sarah attributed this change in behavior to the death of her husband. Her child was struggling with the death of his father, as any child would. Sarah's diary notes only once that he complained of a ringing bell, but also says he frequently spoke of a gray lady whispering to him in his sleep. 3 months after his father's death, 6-year-old Timothy was found dead outside his family home. The boy had leapt from his bedroom window in the middle of the night. The bell's third victim, John Tamber, 1845 to 1884. Cause of death, suicide. After the passing of both her husband and her son, Sarah Hopkins lived as a widow and single mother in Trussville for many years. Her daughter married in 1882 and moved into her husband's home, and Sarah remarried in 1884 to John Tamber, a neighbor. Once the two moved in together, her husband became distant and began suffering from the same symptoms as had her first husband and her departed son. The incessant ringing of a bell, headaches, and the voice of a gray woman whispering to him at night. That very year, Sarah Hopkins found her husband dead, hanging from the same rafters in the farmhouse as her first husband. On the nightstand, inexplicably, was the brass bell. This is when Sarah, in her diary, first writes that the bell is cursed. She left the item in the farmhouse, where she swore to never return. Sarah Hopkins died of natural causes in her home in June of 1911. The bell's fourth victim, Ashton Montclair, 1998 to 2016. Cause of death, suicide. After the passing of Sarah Hopkins' second husband, the farmhouse in rural Trussville obtained a reputation of being haunted. The property became stigmatized and remained untouched for over a century. In October of 2016, 18-year-old Ashton Montclair broke into the abandoned farmhouse with his girlfriend. As later reported by his girlfriend, They were becoming intimate when he suddenly turned pale and became frantic. He asked her if she heard a bell and became transfixed on the upstairs guest room. When she went to check on him, she found Ashton dead, having cut his own throat. The Bell's fifth victim, Stuart Bonham, 1991 to 1920. Cause of death, suicide. In January of 2020, a home inspector was assessing the farmhouse where he discovered the dead body of Stuart Bonham, a homeless man who had a criminal history of substance abuse. Bonham had hung himself in the same room as the others. I first heard the tale of the haunted farmhouse in Trussville, Alabama many years ago, but only this past summer found the time to visit. I was in the guest room when I noticed the brass bell sitting quietly on the nightstand, collecting dust. Fascinated, I took the trinket for myself, excited to discover its secrets. Locals argue that the farmhouse is haunted, that it is what mysteriously took the lives of those 5 poor souls. However, I am of the opinion that it is the brass bell which carries the curse. As noted previously, I do not know from where the brass bell originates, why the men around it have heard ringing, or who the Gray Lady might be, but the coincidences are uncanny. I hate to part with the artifact before I learn more, but I must admit, I've not been sleeping well these past few months, and sometimes, in the middle of the night, I hear a faint ringing in my study. To the person who purchases the brass bell, the item will be meticulously packaged and delivered with a copy of its history. Thank you for hearing this tall tale, and I wish you all the best. Sincerely, J.W. Smithworth. I first came across the enchanted goblet of Salem in June of 2007 in Salem, Massachusetts. The goblet was not what brought me to this part of the United States, but it was surely the most fascinating item that I came across on this expedition. At the time, the goblet was in the possession of a man named Thomas Druckner, and it had been in his family for over 300 years. Along with the item, Thomas had several of his family members' journals. These had been passed down from generation to generation and contained some particularly interesting entries. Thomas let me read the journals, and upon recognizing my interest, was happy to sell me the goblet. The following is the item's history as I have come to understand it. From the Journal of Hans Fischer. In June of 1685, Hans Fischer was searching for a witch. This was, of course, a period when witches flourished in the United States. The horrendous events of the Salem witch trials would not occur until 1692, and as such, the search for a witch was a more reasonable endeavor than it would be today. What caught my attention, though, was the fact that the witch he had found was Stella Cloyce. This is a name I was already very familiar with. Stella was one of the most revered witches of the time. She inhabited a small house in the outskirts of Salem. She was not a hospitable person, but despite her unwelcoming demeanor, she was also not an evil one. Hans Fischer asked Stella for a love potion. This is something extraordinarily rare and difficult to concoct, but Stella Cloyce was no ordinary witch. She, in fact, wrote extensively about potions and enchantments. The following is a direct quote from her personal writings regarding love potions. One of the primary quandaries with love potions is that they are finite, where love, of course, is not. A potion's effect will only exist while it resides in the individual system, and thus love potions in and of themselves are futile. Enchantments, on the other hand, are eternal, and thus enchantments are the true route for manufactured love. In his journal, Hans wrote that Stella had given him an enchanted goblet. Her instructions were clear. On the night of the full moon, he was to fill the goblet with water and drink it at the strike of midnight. She told him that the enchantment would infatuate the woman he loved. The catch, though, was that the effects would only last for a month. Every full moon, for the rest of his life, Hans would have to drink from the goblet at the strike of midnight. Hans followed her instructions, and within days, he met a woman named Edith. They fell madly in love. Hans never missed a full moon, and within the year, the two were married. They lived a long and happy life together and had one child, a girl by the name of Marie. From the diary of Marie Fischer. Hans Fischer passed away in January of 1709, 4 months after his wife. On his deathbed, Hans told Marie of the goblet and how it had won him the love of her mother. Marie was no skeptic and was quite studied in witchcraft. She took her father's words to heart and drank from the goblet at midnight on the full moon. Within weeks, she was dating Stefan Druckner, the man who she would go on to marry. 1 year later, in 1710, Marie and Stefan had their first child, a boy named Alan. Marie was steadfast in her beliefs. She drank from the enchanted goblet every full moon for the rest of her life. When Marie Fischer passed away in 1745, she told her son, her only remaining unwed child, of the enchanted goblet and how it had found love for both her and her father. She instructed him to drink from it every full moon at midnight and to never falter. From the Journal of Alan Druckner. Alan Druckner was not a believer in witchcraft, but he drank from the goblet regularly in honor of his mother and her deathbed wish. At the time of his mother's passing, Alan had never been in a relationship. Within days of drinking from the goblet, he met Emily Sheldon, who he would marry the next year, in 1746. They had one son who they named Finn. The two lived many happy years together until 1757, when Emily unexpectedly left him. Alan makes it clear in his journal that the separation came as a complete surprise. He loved Emily with all his heart, and her leaving devastated him. Soon after Emily left, Alan fell into a deep depression. It was not until several years later that he told his son about the enchanted goblet, and how he had stopped drinking from it in March of 1757. He tried drinking from the goblet again, but his and Emily's relationship never recovered. Alan gave the goblet to his son and died of alcohol poisoning, or perhaps loneliness, 2 years later. From my conversations with Thomas Druckner. The enchanted goblet was stored in the attic of Alan Druckner's home and forgotten. The house was passed down through the family, and eventually the title fell to Thomas Druckner, the man of whom I met in June of 2007. He was married at the time, and his wife was pregnant with a child of their own. Thomas had recently discovered the goblet and accompanying journals. He was already married, but for fun, he had drunk from the goblet as instructed. He did not believe the legend associated with it. For this reason, when I expressed interest in the goblet, he was quick to offer it to me for a reasonable sum. I, of course, accepted. When I visited Thomas again in 2011, I found that he no longer lived in the family home. I eventually tracked him down and learned that he had succumbed to alcoholism. He and his wife had divorced in December of 2007, and the heartbroken man never recovered. The enchanted goblet of Salem has been in my collection for several years now, but I have never drunk from it. Love is something I have already known, and though they are gone, my heart will always be with them. I do not know if the goblet still carries with it the witch's enchantment, but I do not wish to find out. Perhaps you do. To the person who purchases the enchanted goblet, the item will be meticulously packaged and delivered with a copy of its history. Thank you for reading this tall tale, and I wish you all the best. Sincerely, J.W. Smithworth. I first came across the cursed milk bottle in June of 2016 outside of the town of Freiburg, Germany. A story had brought me to the Black Forest, and I found that the story happened to revolve around this cursed item. At the time, the bottle was in the possession of a man named Thomas Wagner. It had been sitting in storage untouched for almost 50 years. The following is the item's history, as I have come to understand it. In 1925, a man named Hans Fischer came across a mysterious cabin deep in Germany's Black Forest. It appeared abandoned, so Hans pilfered the cabin. I understand that he took several items. Among them was the milk bottle. Within months of having stolen the milk bottle, Hans Fischer fell mysteriously ill. Records state that the once strong and healthy man quickly fell into a state of malnutrition. Between the robbery and his time of death only a month later, Hans dropped from 180 pounds to only 85 pounds. What made his death a particular interest were the reports from his wife and the townsfolk regarding his behavior during this period. You see, despite having lost almost 100 pounds in such a short period of time, people spoke of his voracious appetite. Hans went from 3 meals a day to 5 meals a day to 7 meals a day, and as his hunger grew, he became impatient. His wife reported witnessing him guzzling fresh eggs from the chicken coop. A few days later, the butcher saw Hans take meat behind the store, where he devoured it raw. In a particularly disturbing writing, Hans's wife found her husband crawling through a field eating maggots and slurping fungus off the underside of stones. Hans stopped working. He stopped spending time with his family and friends. He went from a healthy, happy, prominent member of town to a disgusting, reviled creature who scoured the streets, begging for food and inhaling rancid scraps. This case, of course, is quite a strange one. A man eats enormous amounts of food and not food, while simultaneously losing half his body weight over the course of a month. In July of 1925, Hans was found dead in a gutter, skin hanging loosely off his skeletal frame. His finger and toenails had been chewed off, and there was fabric dangling from his mouth. He had choked while trying to eat his own shirt. Around the time of his death, Hans's wife Clara experienced the same symptoms. Her appetite became ravenous, she lost substantial body weight, and a month later, she was found dead in a field. Her autopsy revealed several pounds of mud and dirt in her stomach. After their deaths, the Fisher property was auctioned off, and the farm went to the Wagner family in 1926. No further cases of this horrific affliction were reported until 1964. Surprisingly, or maybe not so, Leon Wagner, the 22-year-old son of Luca Wagner, succumbed to the same fate as had Hans and Claire Fisher. The man went from promising member of society to vagrant. One day, his parents found him crouched behind a shed in the yard, hunched over, humiliated, with blood on his face. He had caught a rat and eaten it alive. This was the last straw. They checked him into an asylum where he died only a day later. The cause of death, somehow, was starvation. Of course, I was transfixed by this story. Where did this illness come from? What was the connection between these three people, and why had nobody else suffered from this disgusting and tragic ailment? I knew that the onset came from the robbery of the mysterious cabin in the Black Forest, but there were several items taken. I have not been able to determine who the owner of the cabin was or where the cabin is, so I do not have any information regarding the origins of these items. However, in my efforts to discover more, I was flipping through an old family album. One particular photograph caught my eye. It was of Leon Wagner sitting at the kitchen table, drinking from the milk bottle. On the back was written, "Going through storage, Leon Wagner, October 1964. This date was 1 month prior to Leon's death, almost to the day. Since then, the milk bottle had been in storage, hidden at the back of a closet in the Wagner house. It remained there until June 2016, when I purchased it for my collection. The cursed milk bottle of Friedberg has been in my collection for several years now, but I have never drunk from it. I do not know if the bottle still carries the cursed illness, but I do not wish to find out. If you choose to purchase the item, I strongly advise you to do so as a keepsake, memento, or display piece. Whatever you do not drink from it. To the person who purchases the cursed milk bottle, the item will be meticulously packaged and delivered with a copy of its history. Thank you for reading this tall tale, and I wish you all the best. Sincerely, J.W. Smithworth. In August of 2013, I visited the small town of Cloutierville, Louisiana, to investigate the cellar of a small, abandoned farmhouse. I was drawn to this farmhouse because, in 1932, a woman was murdered here, and in 1933, her husband mysteriously vanished. While this situation alone was not of particular interest to me, the story surrounding it captured my attention. The following is the history of the haunted candle of Cloutierville, as I have come to understand it. In 1932, the farmhouse in Cloutierville, Louisiana, was owned by Adam and Emily Benoit. Adam was a farmer, a hard man, and not a particularly likable one. Although he did run a successful farm, he was also an alcoholic and spent most nights at the local pub. Emily, his wife, was a quiet woman who did not have any social ties and spent all her time at home alone. In June of 1932, Emily was found murdered in the cellar of her home. Police records state that she had been struck from behind by a blunt object. The police were able to determine that she did not die immediately. She had crawled from the place of impact to the back of the cellar. In her outstretched hand was a candle holder, which would have been the only source of light in the dark and dingy cellar. Adam Benoit was listed as a primary suspect, but he had an alibi. He was with his friend that night at the pub. This friend was a local drunkard with less than stellar reputation, but nevertheless, Adam's alibi was accepted, and the murder of Emily Benoit to this day remains unsolved. Early in February of 1933, Adam Benoit was reported missing. He had not been seen at the pub for several days, and this was out of the ordinary for the recent widower. Police investigation led to the cellar in which Emily had been murdered. The investigating officer wrote that he had heard a man sobbing, but he found the cellar empty. The only sign that anyone had been there was a single candle burning against the back wall. The officer wrote that, upon extinguishing the candle, the sobbing faded. The officer also found the word, alone, had been carved into the wall. The whereabouts of Adam Benoit went unsolved. He was never seen again. The following year, in 1934, the farmhouse was purchased by a man named John Morrell. When he was not seen or heard from for several weeks, police officers once again entered the cellar. They found the very same candle flickering dimly in the shadows. The police officers once again reported hearing a man sobbing and noted having seen the shadow of a woman flickering in the candlelight. When the candle was extinguished, the voices stopped, and the woman disappeared. Written on the wall were the words, "Alone, alone, alone." John Morrell was never seen or heard from again, and the farmhouse, to this day still in his name, fell into disrepair. When I visited the farmhouse in 2013, I had every intention of exploring the cellar. The building had long been abandoned, so I broke the cellar lock and cautiously went inside. I found the room untouched. Dusty wine bottles filled the shelves, and rusty old tools were piled in the corner. At the back of the cellar, I found a candle covered in dust and burned almost to the end. All over the cellar, I found one word written over and over and over. Across the walls, across the ceiling, across the shelves. Alone. As I had expected, the word was written in two distinct styles, and I had come prepared. I compared the writing to that of the journal of Adam Benoit and to the deed of John Morrell. The two styles were identical. This was the writing of the two men. In my curiosity, I lit the candle. Softly at first, and then louder. I heard sobbing. The sound of lost, hopeless men, the weeping of those abandoned to an eternity of nothingness. And in the shadows, the figure of a woman slowly drifted into view, dancing towards me. I quickly extinguished the flame and left the cellar. Of course, I brought the candle with me. I did not want it to claim any more unsuspecting lives. The haunted candle of Cloutierville has sat quietly in my collection for several years now. Only once since that day did I light the candle. It was in my attic, amongst my collection. And almost immediately I heard that quiet sobbing of the poor souls lost in time. I immediately snuffed out the flame. The next day, carved into a rafter in my attic, I discovered a single word: alone. To the person who purchases the haunted candle holder, the item will be meticulously packaged and delivered with a copy of its history. Thank you for reading this tall tale, and I wish you all the best. Sincerely, J.W. Smithworth. I first met Alyona Agapov in October of 1976 when I was traveling through eastern Russia. Aliona lived in a tiny locality by the name of Bereznik, and at the time she was already an intuitive of substantial renown. For those unfamiliar, an intuitive is not unlike a psychic, medium, or spiritualist. However, Aliona was very particular about her terminology and insisted on being referred to as an intuitive, one who shares a connection with the spiritual world. Back then, Aliona was known primarily for the seances she performed, wherein she would connect the living with her loved ones who had recently passed away. By all accounts, she was extremely reliable in providing comfort to those in mourning. It was for this reason that I visited her, as my own mother had recently passed. I remember entering her tent for the first time. There was a thick scent of perfume, and I was surprised to find a woman not much older than myself. She had a calming presence about her. When she spoke, her voice floated, and her words seemed to hang in the air. She wore simple, brightly colored robes, and around her neck were the blessed mala beads. While exactly what she told me I will keep to myself, I must say that Aliona was incredibly accurate. She spoke of my deceased mother and told me things which no other person could have known. Aliona also commented on my romantic future, which I can now say she predicted with startling accuracy, and spoke to me of my past lives. I knew immediately and unequivocally that this woman was connected with the spirit world. As you might expect, Aliona and I became fast friends. We shared much in common, including a fascination with magical items, an interest in the spirit world, and a passion for travel. We spent many hours discussing spirituality, mysterious magics, and our past lives. When I asked her about how she acquired her abilities, she explained to me that she had been able to sense and communicate with spirits from a very young age. However, to truly connect with the spirit world, she told me an intuitive needs an item to channel their abilities. For Aliona, this item was her mala beads. Every day, Aliona would bless each and every individual bead she wore. She would also bring the beads to holy sites, places of spiritual significance, churches, mosques, temples, and the like, because bringing them to these places strengthened her connection to the spirit world. This is why Aliona traveled the globe. She empowered her mala beads through meditation and prayer on spiritual grounds. Aliona became one of my closest friends. In the 1980s, she spent several years in Peru. In the 1990s, she lived in Southeast Asia, and in the 2000s, she traveled across Africa. Throughout all of her wanderings, her focus was on visiting holy sites, and always she brought with her the mala beads. When Aliona passed away in 2019, I was, of course, devastated. She was a dear friend of mine, and the world had lost one of its most prodigious intuitives. I attended her funeral in Bereznik and was surprised to learn that she had left her mala beads to me. In her will, she wrote that this was because of our shared appreciation for their purpose. These days, I do not desire a connection with the spirit world. I'm old. I am in my old age and content in my understanding of the universe. For this reason, I have decided that the time has come for me to part with the blessed mala beads. They deserve to be with someone who will use them for their true purpose. To the person who purchases the blessed mala beads, please do so with the intent of honoring their original owner. Use them to find meaning in life and to provide guidance to those who are struggling. Two things today's world is in desperate need of. The item will be meticulously packaged and delivered with a copy of its history. Thank you for hearing this tall tale, and I wish you all the best. Sincerely, J.W. Smithworth. In winter of 1998, I was staying in Knickknack, a remote town in Alaska, hiking across vast areas of wilderness. I was several days into a particularly remote trek when I came across a cabin. I had no reason to believe that anyone had been in this area for years, and the snow surrounding the cabin had no tracks, so I decided to investigate further. This was as ramshackle a cabin as one is likely to find. Constructed with logs and rope, it was clear that it had been assembled by a person with only a rudimentary understanding of how to build in the wilderness. Mounted above the door was a human skull with the antlers of a beast sewn into the bone. I must admit, even I, who am familiar with evil places, felt a chill crawl up my spine. Nevertheless, I gathered my courage and entered the cabin. Inside, I found a small fireplace which had not been lit in years. Desks and shelves lined the walls, littered with tools, papers, and other innocuous junk. There was a single bed in the back corner of the cabin with a mattress which had decayed long ago. Resting atop it was a human skeleton. Yet the dead person's remains were not what captured my attention. Instead, I was drawn to the stone altar in the center of the room. It stood at waist height, and there were hooks embedded into the stone, attached to chains, which laid unfurled, rusted, and frozen to the dirt floor. In the center of the blood-stained altar was a notebook. Scribbled on the cover was, "The Diary of a Worthless Soul, His Maggot, the Unworthy Fiend." The first pages bore scientific diagrams of skeletons, ligature systems, and capillary paths. As I continued flipping, I found maps of towns and trails in Alaska, sketches of demons and beasts, and notes detailing the movements and specific individuals throughout the week. What truly made my skin crawl, though, were the pages upon pages of spells and incantations, detailed rites and rituals to summon demons, curse individuals, and pay homage to the devil. Most of these scribblings demanded the usage of human body parts, including specific descriptions such as eyeballs recently plucked from a middle-aged male and the blood of a woman freshly spilled. It was clear that evil had resided in this cabin. I quickly gathered whatever items I could: pens, pots, knives, daggers, various tradesmen's tools, the notebook itself, and a rusted old chisel. I left the skeleton untouched. I imagine these were the remains of the cabin owner, and whatever evils he had brought upon himself I did not want transferred onto me. Upon returning to Tainted, I packed up my things and headed to Anchorage, where I reported to the police what I had found. They informed me that they would investigate. I did not hear from them again, so I decided to instead do my own research. I began by looking into missing persons reports from the 1970s. I was not surprised to come across each of the names I found in the diary. Oliver English, a 37-year-old married man with a family, disappearing in 1972. Sophia Wright, 17, was kidnapped from her backyard in 1974 and never seen again. Charlotte Montoya, 31, disappearing the following year. Jacob Kinsley, age 24, disappeared 1976. Jennifer Wonston, Alexander Frontenac, Benny Raxton. In the end, I found that all 7 individuals tracked in the notebook had disappeared between 1972 and 1978. I do not know exactly what the fate of these missing individuals was, but I do believe that terrible things were done to them. Between the various tools in the cabin and the detailed notes for spells, concoctions, and incantations, I can only imagine the nightmare that these poor souls endured before their eventual passing. I do still hold many of the items I took from the cabin in my possession, including the diary itself. This I do not believe I will ever part with, as I would not want the writings and recipes to fall into the hands of the wrong person. However, I do feel that it is time I release some of these items from my collection. While I do not know if there is any residual power on them from the black magics which they were used for, it is possible. Regardless, the items carry with them a heaviness, a burden, which I can no longer endure. To the person who purchases the serial killer's chisel, the item will be meticulously packaged and delivered with a copy of its history. Thank you for hearing this tall tale, and I wish you all the best. Sincerely, J.W. Smithworth. In December of 2002, I visited an orphanage in Enemosa, Iowa. I visited this orphanage because Irene Walters, the orphan keeper, indicated that there was something amiss with a child in her care. I am not an expert on children, but I am very well versed in demonology and the paranormal, so I was happy to offer my expertise. The following is the history of the haunted toy car of Enemosa, as I have come to understand it. The Forrester family. The history begins with the Forresters. a young couple who lived in a middle-class suburban home in Cedar Falls, Iowa. Jillian worked as a secretary in a small publishing house, and Benjamin was a mechanic. They were well-liked and active members of the Cedar Falls Catholic community, and by all accounts were respectable, generous people. In July of 1996, Jillian and Benjamin gave birth to their first and only child, a boy named Gary Forrester. Tragically, Jillian died during childbirth, and Benjamin, devastated by the loss of his wife and exhausted from his many hours at the hospital, crashed into a tree on the drive home. Benjamin died instantly. Gary, remarkably, was unharmed, and so the newborn entered the foster system. The Gray family. The Grays were a happy, middle-class family of three: Joseph, Emily, and their 3-year-old daughter, Angela. Unable to have more biological children, the parents decided to adopt and were blessed with Gary Forrester in August of 1996. When Gary was 6 years old, tragedy struck once again. Joseph, Emily, and Angela Gray were killed in a hit-and-run incident. The perpetrator was never caught, and Gary once again entered the foster system. The orphanage. In 2002, Gary was placed in the orphanage run by Irene Walters. Now, it is not abnormal for children who have experienced trauma to have difficulty bonding with their peers, but Gary was particularly resistant. He kept to himself and would sit in corners, facing the wall, rolling his toy cars along the warped floorboards. When Irene contacted me, it was because she believed Gary was possessed. Several times, she witnessed his eyes turn to an aggressive, demanding yellow. Although this would only last for a couple of seconds, these moments terrified her. Irene described the otherwise quiet and obedient child as violent and contentious. Twice, while yellow-eyed, he threatened her life. He said he would kill her with a car. Quote, "like I killed my parents," unquote. Upon hearing this testimony, I recommended an exorcist and began looking into Gary's past. If he was possessed, I needed to determine what would have caused it. The following are my findings. Claire Vernon, nurse at the hospital when Gary was born. My research began at the hospital where Gary Forrester was born. Here, I spoke to Claire Vernon, who was one of the nurses present during the boy's birth. Interestingly, Claire told me that Jillian and Benjamin had arrived at the hospital pale and shaken. Where most parents are full of energy when giving birth to their first child, Claire described Jillian and Benjamin as morose and lethargic. Of even greater importance, Claire told me that when Gary was born, his eyes were an aggressive yellow. She emphasized how unsettling it was, how the eyes appeared to have a clarity and anger to them which no newborn should. However, after a few moments, the baby's eyes turned to brown. Jerry and Harriet Caring, friends of the Gray family. I met Harriet and Jerry Caring at the church which the Gray family attended. The Carings were good friends of the Grays and spoke highly of the family. They told me that Joseph and Emily were good people who loved their children, and they spoke at length about Angela. They did not offer much information regarding Gary Forrester. When I pressed, the Carings described Gary as a quiet child who rarely spoke and never interacted with other children. Whenever they visited the Gray home, Gary would be sitting in a corner, facing a wall, playing with his toy cars. Yet despite his quiet and submissive demeanor, they told me that Gary had been caught urinating in the holy water and stealing from the church donation box. They also recounted a particularly alarming story wherein his parents had caught Gary torturing a cat in the backyard. Daniel Pinta, police officer in Cedar Falls, Iowa. Eventually, my research led me to the obituary for the Forresters in the Cedar Falls newspaper. Alongside them, I noticed that there was another death that day. I contacted the Cedar Falls Police Department and was able to speak to Officer Daniel Pinta. Daniel told me that on the day of Gary's birth, a 5-year-old boy was struck and killed by a car outside of his home. The perpetrator was never found. When I investigated this further, I found that the street on which the boy was killed was very close to the home of Benjamin and Jillian Forrester. When I delved further, I discovered that the street was on the exact route that Benjamin and Jillian took to the hospital on the day Gary was born. I contacted Irene Walters and recommended she speak to an exorcist. I went to visit Gary on the day of the planned exorcism. I found him sitting in a corner, head down, playing with his toy cars. As I approached, the little boy stiffened. When I knelt behind him, he slowly turned to face me. His eyes were a piercing yellow. "Take it and go," he spat, with a venom in his voice that no child should be capable of. He scowled and dropped an orange and brown station wagon into my open hand. Almost immediately, Gary's eyes turned to brown, and his demeanor changed. His shoulders slumped, his head dropped. The little boy turned his back to me and sat quietly in the corner, rolling another of his toy cars, back and forth, back and forth. The priest never arrived to perform the exorcism. He was killed in a collision en route to the orphanage. The priest's vehicle? An orange and brown station wagon. That week, Irene Walters resigned from her position at the orphanage. Shortly later, the orphanage was shut down, and the children were distributed across the country. Despite my best efforts, I lost track of Gary Forrester. For years, the haunted toy car of Anamosa has sat in my collection, a sinister reminder of the failed exorcism of an innocent child. Although I have no proof, I believe that Gary was possessed when his parents killed a young boy on the way to the hospital where he was born. I do not know where Gary is today, but I fear that he still carries the demon with him. Perhaps the toy car does as well. To the person who purchases the haunted toy car of Anamosa, the item will be meticulously packaged and delivered with a copy of its history. Thank you for hearing this tall tale, and I wish you all the best. Sincerely, J.W. Smithworth. I must admit that when I first obtained the tainted vase of vial forest, I did not think it was an item I would one day part with. At best, the trinket is a chilling reminder of a tragic affliction. At worst, it is something much darker. The truth is that I have not dared to find out which, and the younger version of myself thought that nobody else should either. However, with age comes wisdom, and I have decided that it is not my place to make this decision for another. The following is the history of the tainted vase of vial forest, as I have come to understand it. In 1995, I was in Białowieża, a tiny village in the heart of Białowieża Forest in Poland. For those unfamiliar, Białowieża Forest is an enormous, primeval forest, an ancient woodland which has remained largely undisturbed for centuries. This forest is among the deepest and darkest I have yet ventured, and the small town of Białowieża in the midst of it is riddled with mystery. It was in this village that I heard tell of a creature imprisoned in the old town dungeons, a monster the locals referred to only as the Devourer. The stories surrounding this man were fascinating but misaligned and reeked of exaggeration. Intrigued and unconvinced of the histories the locals told, I decided to investigate myself. With a little convincing and a well-placed bribe, I was allowed to visit the creature's cell. In a dark stone room several stories below ground, I found the sallow, sickly figure cowering in a corner. His skin was pale, his clothes tattered, and his demeanor pitiful. I tossed him some raw meat which the guard had provided me, and the creature tore into it. As his hunger waned, his lucidity grew, and I was able to strike up a conversation. This is Adolk Kaminsky's story. It should be noted that, in addition to my conversations with Adolk, I spoke to his mother, Lena, who to this day resides in Adolk's childhood home in Szczecin. This story features insights provided by her, by Adolk himself, and by some of the more reputable Białowieża locals. Adolk was an adventurer. He spent his youth dreaming of faraway places, and as soon as he came of age, he left to explore the world. Every forest, every cave, every region of even moderate interest, he had to discover for himself. He was intrepid, excited, a young man with a thirst for adventure and a tireless interest in the unknown. It was several years into his wanderings when he came across a substantial, unmapped clearing in the depths of the vial forest. This was a desolate, grotesque place, a stark wilderness of black rocks and oily moss. Adok immediately knew this land was corrupted, but even as a well-traveled man, he yearned for adventure. And the nameless meadow promised just that. Deep in the clearing, he came across a tiny wooden cabin, inhabited by a hunchbacked old crone. They did not converse, whatever language she spoke he was not familiar with, but intrigued by the woman, he followed her lead. When she handed him an old brass vase, he took it. When she indicated for Adok to pluck a single flower and place it in the vase, he did so. But when he did, she cackled. She entered her cabin and locked the door. Chilled to the bone, even Adok, the most adventurous of adventurers, left the glade immediately, and he took the vase with him. I feel the need to interject here. Adok could not speak of this encounter without breaking down in tears. He could muster only a word or two between sobs. The anguish and despair with which the man spoke was contagious. It sucked the air from the cell and drowned the spirit of all in his presence. I personally was overcome with grief. I cannot begin to imagine, or perhaps I do not want to imagine, the depths of Adok's sorrow. Upon returning to Vial, Adok told me that an urge built rapidly, a yearning for meat, a heinous desire to gnaw the flesh off human bones. He tried to suppress the craving, to silence it, but his hunger only grew. He was famished, starving, insatiable. He fought the compulsion for as long as he could, but awoke one day covered in blood, with the remains of his victim torn and butchered by his side. And even as his revulsion intensified, he could not stop himself. Sobbing, disgusted, horrified, he slipped another piece of human flesh into his mouth. When the locals finally caught him, Adok had lost most of himself to the curse. No longer did he dream of travel or gaze up at the night sky. Instead, he cowered in dark alleyways, waiting for someone to tread too close, fixated on nothing but his next meal. Adok told me that he had never removed the flower from the vase for fear that doing so would end his life. But now he had been locked away for so long, and he was barely recognizable as the man he once was. He was ready for death. Adok told me where he had hidden the vase and pleaded with me to empty its contents. The once intrepid explorer now yearned for nothingness. I, of course, followed through with my promise. I located the vase and found it had a single wilted and rotten flower drooping over the edge. I dumped the remnants deep in the Vial forest, and upon returning to visit with Adok once again, found that he had passed away. As noted previously, I added the tainted vase of Vial forest to my collection, but never dared to tamper with it. I do not know if the curse that afflicted Adok Kaminsky is still carried by the vase, or whether placing a flower in it will plant the same burden on another. What I do know is that I am unwilling to find out. Perhaps you are. To the person who purchases the tainted vase of Vial forest, the item will be meticulously packaged and delivered with a copy of its history. Thank you for reading this tall tale, and I wish you all the best. Sincerely, J.W. Smithworth. While I typically make effort to remain impartial when sharing the histories of my items, the truth is that I cannot tell this story without including my personal biases. The Witch Doctor's vial is among the most treasured items in my collection. This is because the Witch Doctor was the closest thing I ever had to a father. That said, the following is the story of how I obtained the Witch Doctor's vial. I grew up homeless with my mother in the slums of a poverty-stricken city. I prefer to keep this city private. I do not believe the location of it is particularly relevant. I do not believe the location is of particular relevance. As is the case in all slums, though, life was difficult. We survived as scroungers, spending our days sifting through piles of garbage, looking for anything to trade for food. It was a hard, thankless life, and one my mother and I desperately wanted to escape. The jungles enclosing this ghetto were famously brutal. We were warned not to venture in. Tales of enormous beasts and toxic plants kept the destitute in line. But a refusal to accept my lot in life and a fascination with the natural world drove me into the forest. It was here that I came across a decrepit old shack. It was littered with books and parchments. Writings had been scribbled on the walls. Vials and elixirs lined the shelves, and in the back, there was a powerful elderly man, quietly dredging his retort. My mother and I ended up living with the hermit for years. The man taught me to read and write, and showed me how to brew all manner of concoctions using ingredients from the local flora. He also taught me of mysticism and the supernatural, and inspired my lifelong fascination with the extraordinary. As the years passed, my mother and I came to learn that the hermit was not the isolated man we had believed him to be. We would notice him leave in the middle of the night, bringing with him scrolls he had written and potions he had concocted, and he would return in the morning empty-handed. When my mother and I confronted him, the witch doctor reluctantly told us the truth. He would regularly deliver his mixtures to the slums I grew up in. He never asked for anything in return, but he used the black market to supply medicine to the poor and poisons to the oppressed. In time, I came to view him as a medicine man, a figure of hope for the hopeless, and a symbol of rebellion against tyranny. While some may not agree with the man's actions, he was certainly a hero in my eyes. The witch doctor was always kind and generous to my mother and I. He took in a mother and her child without question, raised me as his own, taught me much of what I understood of the world, and worked tirelessly to ease the lives of the poor. Before he passed away, the witch doctor delivered one enormous final shipment to the slums, and for the first time, accepted payment. This payment he gave to my mother, the last action of the man to whom we owe everything. My mother and I used this money to leave the city, and we were able to establish ourselves and begin a new life, one we had previously never dreamed possible. I still hold a few items in my collection which were used by the witch doctor, most of which I will never part with. I've become sentimental and live for nostalgia, and those particular items will remain with me until the end. But I do not want the witch doctor to be forgotten, and by sharing the story of his vial, the very one with which he brewed his poisons and potions, I hope to also preserve his legacy. To the person who purchases the witch doctor's vial, please do so with the intent of honoring its original owner. The witch doctor was a man who believed in love, in freedom, and in equality, ideals which I too consider among the most important in the world. The item will be meticulously packaged and delivered with a copy of its history. Thank you for hearing this tall tale, and I wish you all the best. Sincerely, J.W. Smithworth.